I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of chili, when my son Daniel came stomping into the house, yelling into his phone like the whole world owed him something. And at 35 years old, he was still living with me in my little house on the south side of Milwaukee. He always said it was to keep me company, but I knew the truth. He couldn't hold down steady work after his divorce, and bills piled up faster than he could pay them. That morning, his anger was directed at his ex-wife, Jessica, because once again, she hadn't sent over the child support for my grandson, Ethan, who was barely 10 years old and already carrying more sadness in his small body than any child ever should. I turned the stove down, wiped my hands on the towel, and asked Daniel if he wanted lunch before heading back out. Instead of answering, he spun around with that fiery glare in his eyes and shouted, "Can't you see I'm on the phone, old woman?" The words hit me like a slap, but what came next was worse. He leaned over and spit right in my face. Actual spit sliding down my cheek, and went right back to cussing into his phone like I wasn't even there. My knees wobbled, my stomach clenched, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. All I could do was wipe my face with my apron and swallow the humiliation whole. My name is Marguerite Turner. I'm 68 years old, and I've never been a weak woman. I raised Daniel alone after his father, Jack, walked out when Daniel was only 6. I worked as a seamstress in a factory for 40 years, bent over machines until my fingers were raw, just to buy this house and give him a better life. I poured my youth, my health, and every dollar into making sure my boy had the chance to succeed. This home, tucked on a quiet street with a maple tree in front and the white siding I painted myself every other summer, was supposed to be my sanctuary. But ever since Daniel moved back in after his divorce 3 years ago, my sanctuary had become a prison. He treated me like the maid, barking orders, leaving his dirty clothes in piles, snapping at me in front of Ethan. I stayed quiet, swallowing the insults, telling myself it was temporary, that he just needed time to get back on his feet. But that morning, as I stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection, my cheeks still damp from my own son's spit, I felt something shift deep inside me. It wasn't anger at first. It was grief, like kind that shakes you to your bones because you realize the person you love most in this world sees you as nothing. Later that afternoon, after Daniel stormed out and left Ethan with me like always, my grandson came over, hugged me around the waist, and whispered, "Grandma, why does Dad yell at you so much?" His voice was small, trembling, and that question struck me harder than any insult Daniel had ever hurled. I realized then that Ethan was growing up believing it was normal to disrespect your elders, especially women, and I couldn't let that seed take root in his little heart. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, staring at the dim glow of the stove clock, and for the first time, I looked at my life with cold clarity. Daniel wasn't here to help me. He was using me. The house was in my name, the bills were paid with my Social Security and the small pension I'd earned from the factory. And on top of that, I was raising his son while he drifted from one odd job to another. They thought I was powerless, just an old woman too tired to fight back. But they were wrong. The sky the next morning was overcast, the kind of heavy gray that matches the weight inside your chest. Daniel stumbled into the kitchen, already scowling, already complaining about nothing. "This coffee is too strong," he said, without even looking at me, scrolling through his phone. "Can't you do anything right?" Ethan ran in with his shirt untucked, hair sticking up, his backpack half zipped. I bent down to smooth his collar, and he whispered, "Grandma, we dreamed we lived somewhere happy, just you and me." My throat tightened so hard I could barely swallow. At 10 years old, he was already craving escape from the tension that filled our house like smoke. As Daniel sat glued to his phone, ignoring Ethan's excitement about a school project, my heart cracked open wider. "Dad, my teacher says we have to make a family tree. Ethan said, holding up his worksheet. Not now, I'm busy, he muttered, not lifting his eyes. Ethan's little face fell, and he quietly pushed his cereal around the bowl. I stood at the stove, frozen in place, watching the same scene play out for what felt like the 1,000th time. My son lost in his own bitterness, my grandson desperate for attention, and me, the silent witness holding it all together. That afternoon, when I came home from walking Ethan to school, I found Daniel in my bedroom going through my dresser drawers. "Yeah, Carla," he said into the phone, his voice casual. "The house is in a prime location. Once I get Mom into assisted living, I'll finally be able to fix it up right." My heart lurched so hard I thought I might faint. He looked me dead in the eye as he kept talking, as if daring me to react. "Yeah, the market's hot. This place will be worth double in a few years." He didn't even bother pretending anymore. Later, as I sat in my favorite chair, the same one I used to sit in late at night sewing dresses to pay for Daniel's school clothes, I felt the last bit of denial drain out of me. My own son didn't see me as a mother. He saw me as a burden standing between him and a payday. And that night, lying awake in the dark, I promised myself that I would no longer be silent.
The following weeks peeled away the last illusions I'd been clinging to, revealing just how little my own family respected me, and every discovery cut deeper than the last. Daniel had invited his sister Emily over one Sunday, and I got my hopes up thinking maybe we'd have a quiet family dinner like the old days. So I went all out, roasting a chicken with garlic and herbs, baking cornbread from scratch, even setting the dining table with my best china that I usually kept locked away in the cabinet. And I put on my navy blue dress that always made me feel dignified, like the lady I used to be before life wore me down. But when Emily arrived, she and Daniel went straight into his room and shut the door, whispering loud enough for me to hear snippets of their conversation that sent chills racing up my spine. "Danny, I get it, man," Emily said, her voice smug like she had all the answers. "You're stuck here taking care of Mom 24/7, but you've already done your part. She had her life, now it's your time." And Daniel chuckled bitterly. "Yeah, but I feel like I'm living in a museum. I can't change anything in this house, can't move a couch, can't even breathe without her reminding me it's hers, like I'm 16 again under her roof." And then Emily laughed. "Exactly! And besides, old folks live into their 90s these days. Do you really want to be stuck another 20 years like this?" Their words echoed in my skull like a hammer striking steel, and I stood there with my hands in the dishwater, scrubbing the same plate over and over, trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. Because those weren't strangers talking about me. They were my children, the babies I raised alone, the reason I worked double shifts and sacrificed every joy I could have had. And now they sat behind a closed door, calculating how many years I had left, as if I were a broken-down car they needed to trade in. When they finally came out, Daniel slung his arm around Emily, smiling wide like nothing had happened. "Smells good in here, Mom," he said, as if I hadn't heard every word. And Emily kissed my cheek with a fake grin. "Nobody roasts chicken like you, Mom." But I had already seen behind their masks and heard their real hearts. And that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, realizing that my family truly did see me as an obstacle, an inconvenience to be managed, not a mother to be cherished. After that evening, little things I used to excuse became impossible to ignore. When Daniel brought his buddies over to drink beer in the living room, he'd introduce me as my mom. She stays here with me, as if I were the guest in my own home. When Ethan begged me to read him bedtime stories, Daniel would cut in with, "Leave Grandma alone. She's too old to play games," as if loving my grandson was some burden I couldn't carry. One morning, I overheard Daniel talking to our neighbor about senior living communities in Wisconsin, casually saying, "Yeah, my cousin's mother-in-law is in one. They take good care of her, and honestly, I think Mom would be happy around people her own age, plus it frees up the house." And when I walked in, he switched the subject so fast it was almost comical if it hadn't been about my life. That afternoon, when he left to pick up Ethan, I went into the closet where I kept all my important documents, and what I found made my knees buckle. I had a small lockbox where I kept my will, my bank papers, and Ethan's college savings account info, and I noticed things had been moved around. Some papers had fresh copies, and worst of all, there was a legal document I didn't remember signing, a power of attorney giving Daniel control over my finances if I was ever incapacitated, and my signature stared back at me like a cruel joke. I didn't remember signing it, but it was there. And I realized he had been planning this for months, slowly weaving a web to trap me. That evening, I sat across from him at dinner, watching him scroll on his phone while chewing absent-mindedly, and Ethan tried to tell me about school, his science project about planets. And I smiled at him, but inside my mind raced like a storm. My own son, the boy I raised through sickness and hunger, had stolen from me, manipulated me, and now had legal tools to take everything if he decided to claim I was losing my mind. Later that night, Ethan touched my arm softly and said, "Grandma, are you okay? You look sad." And I kissed his forehead, lying that I was just tired. But inside, I knew my entire world had changed. Daniel wasn't just neglectful, he was dangerous. The very next morning, Daniel announced he was going out with friends. "Mom, you can watch Ethan, right? I need a break." Not asking, but ordering. And while he was gone, I logged into my online banking for the first time in months, something I avoided because I trusted him too much. And what I saw made my blood run cold. He had been dipping into my pension. Little withdrawals at first, $50 here, $75 there. But over the course of 6 months, it added up to thousands. And worse, he had gotten into Ethan's college account, the one I had saved up for years, and nearly $10,000 was gone. All of it siphoned away with excuses I remember him feeding me. "Mom, Ethan needs medicine. The washer broke. My car needs repairs." And I had believed him every time. Sitting at that old computer desk, my chest ached, my head spun, and I finally admitted the truth. My son wasn't just ungrateful, he was stealing from me, robbing my own mother blind and robbing his grandson of a future. When Ethan ran into the kitchen asking me to make him grilled cheese, I kissed his cheeks, wiped my tears quickly, and fed him like nothing was wrong. But inside, I had already made the decision that would change everything. I would not be silent anymore. I would not let my own son treat me like a walking bank account. I would not allow my grandson to grow up believing that this was love. From that moment forward, I lived with two faces. The obedient old mother Daniel thought he still controlled, and the determined woman quietly preparing for a war he didn't even know had started. Because while I went through the motions of cooking his breakfast, folding his laundry, and nodding whenever he barked complaints, behind closed doors, I was making phone calls, gathering information, and slowly building the strength to fight back. And it began with my cousin Charles, who lived up in Madison, a man I hadn't spoken to in years, but who listened patiently as I poured my heart out. Every insult, every stolen dollar, every humiliation. And when I finally stopped crying, he said something that rang in my ears long after the call ended. "Maggie, respect isn't begged for, it's demanded. And if someone refuses to give it, you've got to take it back by force." And that was the first time in years I didn't feel crazy for believing I deserved better. The next step was calling an attorney, Mr. Bennett, the same man who had handled the closing on my house when I first bought it 25 years earlier. And when I brought him the so-called power of attorney papers, he looked at me with grave eyes and said, "Mrs. Turner, this is unfortunately very common. Children manipulate aging parents into signing away control, but you are clearly in full possession of your faculties, and you have every legal right to revoke this immediately." And right then, I signed new documents. Papers that stripped Daniel of every ounce of control he thought he had gained. And I went further. At Mr. Bennett's suggestion, I rewrote my will, taking Daniel out completely and placing everything, including my home and my modest savings, into a trust for Ethan, to be managed independently until he turned 25. Walking out of that law office with the papers tucked neatly in a folder under my arm, I felt lighter than I had in decades, almost giddy, because for the first time in years, the scales were tipping back in my favor, and Daniel had no idea.
That Friday night, he came home smelling like beer, leaning against the counter with that smirk that always made my stomach churn, and said in his fake concern voice, "Mom, I've been thinking maybe it's time we look into some options for you, like a community place where you can have friends and activities, people your age, because here you're just lonely." And I sat down calmly at the kitchen table, hiding the fire raging in my chest, and asked sweetly, "What kind of options, son?" And he launched into his rehearsed speech about senior communities with nurses on site, how he couldn't always keep an eye on me, how I might leave the stove on or trip and break my hip, how selling the house would give us money for the best care. And I smiled gently, telling him I'd think about it. But inside, I cataloged every manipulative word, every fake expression of worry, knowing exactly what game he was playing. That night, I couldn't sleep, replaying every conversation from the past year. All the times Daniel had casually brought up stories of elderly people falling at home, or how expensive it was to maintain a big house, or how lonely I must be without friends my age. All of it a calculated campaign to convince me I was helpless, when in truth he just wanted the house and the cash that came with it. So on Monday morning, before he even woke up, I slipped out of the house with my purse and my most elegant coat, caught the bus downtown, and went straight to the bank. I sat across from the manager, showed him the withdrawals Daniel had made without my consent, and he froze, apologizing over and over, promising that from now on, no one but me would have access. And he helped me change all my accounts, set up new passwords, and lock Daniel out completely. "You have every right to protect yourself," he said, handing me the new paperwork. And I left that building feeling like I'd just broken free from chains I didn't even know I was wearing. But I wasn't done. Back at Mr. Bennett's office, I not only revoked Daniel's power of attorney, I signed over new legal protections, putting Ethan at the center of everything, ensuring his college account was safeguarded and that Daniel would never be able to touch it again. And then I went one step further. I authorized the discreet listing of my house for sale. The realtor nearly gasped when she told me the appraisal, nearly $430,000, far more than I expected. And I nodded with a calm resolve I didn't even know I had. Because if Daniel wanted my house so badly, then I'd give him exactly what he wanted. My absence, but without the prize he thought was his. That evening, Daniel came swaggering into the kitchen, tossing his keys on the counter like he owned the place, and said, "Mom, I made us an appointment with a doctor who specializes in memory issues just to check on you because lately you've been forgetting things and I'm worried." And I agreed without hesitation, knowing exactly what he was trying to pull. But when we got to that doctor's office, I sat tall, answered every question with perfect clarity, rattling off dates, names, and even solving the memory puzzles faster than expected. And I could see Daniel's face tightening with frustration every time I got something right, until finally the doctor leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "Mrs. Turner, your cognitive function is perfectly normal for your age." And the silence in that room was so sweet I wanted to laugh. On the drive home, Daniel gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, muttering that maybe I was just nervous in the office. And I turned to him, my voice steady, and said, "Daniel, my mind has never been clearer." And for the first time in a long time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. That night, as Ethan worked on his science project, a little papier-mâché volcano that he wanted me to help him finish, I leaned in to help tape the edges, and when Daniel rolled his eyes and barked, "Ethan, your grandma's too old for this nonsense. Ask your Aunt Emily instead," I looked right at my grandson and said, "Of course I'll help you, sweetheart." And as his little face lit up with joy, something inside me crystallized. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the lesson Ethan was learning every day in that toxic house. And I knew with absolute certainty that it was time to end the cycle, to break free, and to show them all what a 68-year-old woman still capable of fighting back could do. The day I finally began to execute my plan felt like stepping onto a stage I'd been rehearsing for in secret, and it started quietly,
with me brewing coffee in the early dawn while Daniel still snored down the hall, his phone buzzing nonstop with texts from friends I didn't trust. And as I sipped from my favorite mug, the one Ethan had painted for me at school with shaky little letters spelling "Best Grandma Ever," I laid out the folder of documents I had prepared with Mr. Bennett, each one a weapon sharper than any knife. And I whispered to myself, he has no idea what's coming. Over the next week, I carried myself as though nothing had changed. I cooked Daniel's meals, smiled when he boasted about getting me into the best assisted living community, and even pretended to be grateful when he announced he'd take over the property taxes for the house, as though that weren't my responsibility for decades. But all the while, I was meeting with the realtor behind his back, signing papers, and arranging showings for buyers who walked through the house when Daniel was at the bar or looking for work. I kept Ethan close to me through it all, whispering in his ear that everything was going to be okay, though he couldn't understand the full scope of the storm brewing around us. Then, one Friday evening, when Daniel came home loud and sloppy drunk, he stumbled into the living room where Ethan and I were watching Back to the Future on the old TV, and he pointed at me with that smug grin, slurring, "You think you run this house, Mom, but pretty soon it'll be mine, and then I'll finally be free of your nagging." And Ethan's eyes went wide with fear as Daniel swayed and laughed, and in that moment, I realized the time for secrecy was almost over. Because if Daniel ever caught wind of my plan before the contracts were signed, he might lash out in ways even worse than his words. So the following Monday, I met with the buyer, a kind retired couple from Madison who wanted to move closer to their grandchildren. And when they placed the final offer, I signed the paperwork with a steady hand, transferring the house into escrow and securing nearly $500,000 into a protected trust for Ethan and me. Walking out of that office, I felt decades of weight lift off my shoulders. I no longer feared being thrown into a facility against my will because Daniel couldn't touch a dime of it. Not legally, not now that the protections were airtight. When I returned home that evening, Daniel was waiting in the driveway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, and he said, "Where have you been, Mom? You're always sneaking around lately." And I smiled sweetly, telling him I'd gone shopping, lifting a grocery bag as proof, while inside my pulse thundered, because I knew suspicion had entered his mind. The tension grew sharper with each passing day. Daniel watching me closer, asking nosy questions, even rifling through my purse when he thought I wasn't looking. And Ethan clung to me more than ever, whispering, "Grandma, when are we going to live in that happy place from my dream?" And I kissed his forehead, promising him that soon, very soon, we'd be free. Finally, the day came when the sale officially closed. The funds were wired into the trust, the deed transferred, and I had only one thing left to do: tell Daniel that the house he'd schemed over for years was no longer his prize. That night, I cooked his favorite, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, setting the table as if it were any other evening, but when we sat down to eat, I slid the folder across the table, opened it, and calmly explained, "Daniel, the house has been sold. The money is safe in a trust for Ethan, and I've arranged a new place for us to live. You will not be a part of it." For a moment, he blinked, confused. Then his face twisted with rage, his fist slamming the table so hard the silverware jumped, and he shouted, "You senile old witch! You think you can outsmart me?" His voice shook the walls, but I didn't flinch. "I already have," I said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Ethan whimpered, clutching my arm, and Daniel stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. That night, I barely slept, half expecting him to return with fists instead of words. But dawn broke quiet, and when Ethan and I packed our suitcases into the back of a rental car, I knew there was no turning back. We drove 2 hours north to a quiet town near Green Bay, where I had found a modest little 2-bedroom apartment with sunshine streaming through the windows and a playground down the street. And as I unpacked dishes in the kitchen while Ethan ran outside to play with neighborhood kids, I breathed in the first true peace I'd felt in years.
Daniel called non-stop for days, leaving voicemails filled with curses, threats, even sobbing apologies. But I ignored them all, because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my safety, and giving Ethan the childhood he deserved. When I finally blocked his number, I sat on the porch swing, watching my grandson laugh as he climbed the jungle gym, and I thought to myself, they thought I was powerless, just an old woman waiting to be pushed aside, but I had shown them, and myself, that it was never too late to take back control. Settling into that little apartment near Green Bay felt like stepping into a new chapter of life I had almost forgotten was possible. A chapter filled with quiet mornings where I could drink coffee in peace, afternoons where Ethan's laughter echoed from the playground instead of being drowned out by Daniel's shouting, and evenings where I could read him stories without fear of someone barging in to tell me I was too old. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by sacrifice, but by choice. Yet even as I unpacked boxes and hung curtains, Daniel's shadow loomed. His voicemails grew uglier by the day, first filled with rage, accusing me of betrayal, then turning to guilt trips about how I had abandoned him after all he'd done, then finally sliding into desperate promises that he'd change, that he'd get help, that he just needed me to give him one more chance. And though I deleted each message without responding, the echoes lingered in my chest, reminding me that cutting him off wasn't just a decision, it was a wound that would take time to heal. Still, I knew I had made the right choice because Ethan began to blossom before my eyes. The dark circles under his eyes faded, replaced by the sparkle of a boy who felt safe. And he started drawing pictures at school of a house with me and him inside, sunshine overhead, no angry shadows in the doorway. And when his teacher called to tell me how much happier he seemed, I cried quietly in my bedroom, thanking God for the chance to give him this gift. But Daniel wasn't done with me, not by a long shot. 2 weeks after the move, I was sitting at the kitchen table going through bills when a loud knock rattled the door. And when I opened it, a man in a suit handed me a stack of papers. A lawsuit. Daniel had filed for guardianship, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs and that he, as my son, should be placed in control of my finances. For a moment, my knees went weak, the fear crashing over me like a wave, but then I remembered Mr. Bennett, the careful paperwork we had filed, the doctor's clean bill of mental health, and I straightened my shoulders, thanking the man politely before closing the door. That night, I explained everything to Ethan in the simplest terms I could, telling him that Daddy was trying to take away our freedom, but that Grandma wasn't afraid anymore. And though his little face crumbled in worry, I reassured him with every ounce of strength in me that we were safe. The following weeks were a blur of court filings, meetings with Mr. Bennett, and long nights of doubt where I lay awake wondering if maybe Daniel would win, if maybe a judge would look at my gray hair and trembling hands and decide I wasn't capable. But every time fear threatened to break me, I thought of Ethan's drawings, his laughter, his whispered, "Grandma, don't let them take me." And I steeled myself anew. The day of the hearing arrived on a blustery Tuesday morning, and as I walked into that courthouse in my best black coat, Ethan clutching my hand, I felt the weight of decades pressing down on me. Not just the fight with Daniel, but every insult, every sacrifice, every night I had worked until my back ached just to give him a better life. And now here I was, defending my right to live it on my own terms. Daniel stood across the aisle looking smug in a suit that didn't quite fit, his lawyer whispering in his ear, and when he caught my eye, he smirked like victory was already his. But when the judge asked to hear evidence, Mr. Bennett calmly presented the doctor's evaluation, proving my mental clarity, the bank record showing Daniel's theft, and the trust papers I had signed to protect Ethan. And as each piece was laid out, I watched the color drain from Daniel's face. Then, when the judge asked if I had anything to say, I stood slowly, my voice trembling at first but gaining strength with every word, and I told the court how I had raised my son alone, how I had worked my fingers raw to give him everything, and how he had repaid me with betrayal, manipulation, and theft. I am not incompetent, I declared, my voice echoing through the room. I am a mother who has finally realized her worth, and I will not be silenced or controlled any longer. By the time I finished, the courtroom was silent except for the scribbling of the clerk's pen. And when the judge finally ruled in my favor, dismissing Daniel's petition entirely, I felt years of change shatter inside me. Daniel stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the hall, and I knew that chapter of my life was over. Back home that evening, Ethan and I celebrated with ice cream sundaes at the kitchen table, and as he smeared chocolate across his cheeks, he looked up at me with shining eyes and whispered, "Grandma, we won!" And I hugged him so tight I thought my heart would burst. In that moment, I realized the truth. I hadn't just fought for myself. I had fought for the next generation, for Ethan to grow up knowing that strength isn't about age or muscle, but about standing up for what is right, even when it means standing against your own blood. After the court victory, life settled into a fragile peace, the kind that feels like standing on new ice. You trust it enough to walk forward, but every creak reminds you how easily it could break. Yet in that fragile peace, Ethan and I found a rhythm that filled my heart with hope. Mornings spent walking him to school under crisp Wisconsin skies, afternoons baking cookies together or helping with his science fair volcano, evenings curled up on the couch watching old sitcoms, our laughter rising into the kind of home I had dreamed of since the day I first held him in my arms. But as much as I wanted to believe Daniel was gone from our lives for good, shadows have a way of creeping back when you least expect them. And his shadow arrived in the form of a letter slipped under my apartment door one rainy Thursday night. I bent down, my knees creaking, and opened it with trembling hands, finding his handwriting scrawled across the page, messy and desperate. "Mom, I made mistakes, I know, but you're still my mother. Please meet me. I need help." For a long time, I just stared at the paper, the rain tapping against the window like fingers urging me to decide, my heart torn between the boy I once nursed through fevers and the man who had tried to strip me of everything. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a diner just outside town, more for closure than reconciliation, and when I walked in, I barely recognized him. His eyes bloodshot, his hair unkempt, his hands trembling as he wrapped them around a coffee cup. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Everything's falling apart." For a moment, pity pierced my armor, but then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But if you just reconsider, we could sell that trust, split it, and all our problems would be over." And just like that, any flicker of hope that he had changed died. I stood slowly, dropping a 20 on the table for his coffee, and said with finality, "Daniel, I already gave you everything. This time, I'm keeping what's mine." His face twisted in anger and he hissed, "You'll regret this, old woman." But I walked out with my head high, the bell above the door chiming like an anthem of freedom. Back home, Ethan was waiting with wide eyes and I hugged him tightly, vowing silently that I would never let Daniel's poison seep into our new life again. But his threats gnawed at me, the way rot hides beneath floorboards, and I decided it was time to make our fresh start permanent. With Mr. Bennett's help, I found a small house in Appleton, modest but bright, with a little backyard where Ethan could play, and I bought it outright through the trust, putting every safeguard in place so Daniel could never touch it. Moving day was a whirlwind of boxes and laughter, and when Ethan ran through the empty rooms shouting, "This is ours, Grandma!" I felt tears spill down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from the sheer miracle of survival. Yet, even as we painted walls and planted flowers, Daniel's shadow lingered. A neighbor told me they had seen a man parked in a car near the block late at night, watching the house. And though I couldn't prove it was him, I didn't need proof. My gut knew. I went to the police, filed a restraining order, and made sure every neighbor had my number in case they saw something suspicious. And slowly, the fear eased as weeks turned into months without incident. Ethan thrived at his new school, making friends, joining the soccer team,
And one evening, as I watched him run across the field in the fading light, his cheeks flushed with joy, I realized that the nightmare we had endured was no longer our present, but our past. And in that realization came a peace deeper than I had ever known. I joined a quilting circle at the local church, started volunteering at the food pantry, and for the first time since my youth, I felt like more than just someone's mother. I felt like myself. Every now and then, a pang of grief would hit me, the reminder that Daniel was out there somewhere, my flesh and blood, lost in his bitterness. But I had learned the hardest truth of all. Sometimes love means letting go, even of your own child, if holding on means drowning with them. One evening, as Ethan and I sat on the porch swing under a sky painted pink with sunset, he looked up at me with those earnest eyes and said, "Grandma, when I grow up, I'm going to take care of you, but not like Dad. I'm going to take care of you because I love you." And in that moment, every scar on my heart felt worth it because I knew I had broken the cycle. I had taught him the difference between love and control, and I had secured for both of us a future free from chains. By the time autumn rolled around, with the leaves in Appleton turning brilliant shades of red and gold, our new life had settled into something almost ordinary, and that ordinariness felt like a luxury after years of walking on eggshells. I woke each morning to the sound of Ethan clattering in the kitchen trying to pour his own cereal, and I spent afternoons quilting with the ladies from church or tending the little garden out back where Ethan and I grew pumpkins for Halloween, and in those small, simple moments, I rediscovered a version of myself I thought had been buried decades ago. A woman who could laugh freely, who could breathe without fear of insults, who could look in the mirror and see not weakness, but survival. Yet even in that new peace, echoes of Daniel's betrayal lingered like scars that ache when the weather changes. And every time the phone rang from an unknown number or a car idled too long near the curb, my stomach tightened, waiting for the next strike. It came one chilly November afternoon when a thick envelope arrived in the mail, the return address marked from a correctional facility in Racine. My hands trembled as I tore it open, scanning the messy handwriting until the words burned into my brain. "Mom, I messed up. I got arrested. They said I stole for my job, but it wasn't my fault. Please bail me out. Please don't abandon me." For hours, I sat at the kitchen table staring at that letter, the clock ticking loudly on the wall, Ethan playing in the next room, and my heart waged war with itself, the mother in me aching to protect my son, the survivor in me screaming that saving him again would undo everything I had built. That night after Ethan went to bed, I lit a candle and prayed, asking God for clarity, and when I finally blew it out, I knew my answer: I would not rescue Daniel this time. The next morning, I called Mr. Bennett to ask what it would mean if Daniel tried to claim anything from me while in jail, and he assured me that the trust was airtight, that my finances were untouchable, and I felt a wave of relief so strong I nearly wept. Still, I couldn't shake the guilt, the little voice whispering that a mother should never turn her back on her child. But then I remembered the spit on my cheek, the stolen money, the threats, the courtroom lies, and I knew this wasn't abandonment, it was self-preservation. Weeks passed, and life went on. Ethan brought home straight-A report cards. The church ladies invited me to lead a quilting workshop, and for Thanksgiving, we roasted a turkey together, just the two of us, filling the house with laughter instead of shouting, joy instead of fear. And when Ethan bowed his head at the table and prayed, "Thank you, God, for my grandma and for our safe home," tears slid silently down my cheeks because I realized that what we had was more than survival. It was redemption. I kept Danion's letter folded in my Bible, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. And every time doubt tried to creep in, I opened it, reread his manipulative pleas, and reminded myself that love does not mean surrender, that protecting myself and Ethan was the truest expression of love I could give. Slowly, the shadow of Daniel faded, replaced by the warm glow of community, of new friends who called me by name, of neighbors who waved when I walked down the street, of Ethan's teachers who told me he was thriving, kind, and full of potential. One evening, as snow began to fall softly outside, Ethan curled up beside me on the couch, his head resting on my shoulder, and whispered, "Grandma, this is the happiest I've ever been." And in that simple, pure moment, I knew beyond a doubt that I had chosen correctly, that walking away from my son had saved not just me, but also the little boy who depended on me to show him what love was supposed to look like. Winter in Wisconsin has a way of testing even the strongest souls, with snow piling high against doors and winds that cut through the thickest coats. But in that season of cold, Ethan and I discovered warmth we had never known before. A
A warmth born not of fireplaces or blankets, but of peace, of safety, of a love untainted by manipulation or fear. Each morning, I shoveled the walkway while Ethan made snow angels in the yard, his laughter rising into the pale sky. And every evening, we cooked dinner together, him proudly chopping vegetables while I stirred the pot. And in those ordinary acts, I found extraordinary healing. Months passed without a word from Daniel until one day in early March, a letter arrived, not from a jail, but from a rehabilitation center. His handwriting more steady this time, his words softer. Mom, I know I hurt you. I know I let you down. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm trying to change. If you can't see me, please at least tell Ethan I love him. I read it 3 times, my heart torn between the instinct to shield myself and the old longing to believe him. But in the end, I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, choosing not to reply. Not out of cruelty, but out of wisdom learned through pain. Because change is not proven with words on paper, but with actions sustained over time. And I would not risk reopening wounds that had only just begun to heal. Ethan asked about his father sometimes, his eyes searching mine for answers I couldn't always give. And when I told him gently that his dad was trying to get better, he nodded solemnly, far older in spirit than his 10 years, and then leaned against me whispering, "As long as I have you, Grandma, I'm okay." Those words anchored me in ways nothing else could. Spring came, with tulips blooming in our little yard and sunshine warming our faces, and I realized we had crossed a threshold. We were no longer just survivors. We were builders of a new life, a life free from fear, a life where my grandson could thrive, and I could finally live as more than a servant to other people's needs. I joined a writing group at the library, began recording my memories of raising Daniel, of working in the factory, of the long nights of sacrifice, because I wanted Ethan to know the truth of our story someday, not the twisted version others might tell. And as I wrote, I discovered that my voice, once silenced by years of insults and control, had power, a power not just to protect, but to inspire. By summer, Ethan had joined a local baseball team, and I became the loudest cheerleader in the stands, waving from the bleachers, clapping until my hands stung, and every time he looked up and saw me, his grin stretched wide, unburdened by the shadows of the past. That July, we took a trip to Lake Michigan, just the two of us, walking barefoot along the shore as the waves lapped gently at our feet. And Ethan turned to me, eyes bright, and said, "Grandma, this feels like the dream I had, the happy place." And I pulled him into my arms, knowing in my bones that we had made it real. And though Daniel's face still flickered in my mind from time to time, though guilt sometimes tried to whisper that I had failed as a mother, I silenced those voices with the truth: I had succeeded as a protector, as a grandmother, as a woman who refused to be broken. I had saved Ethan and myself from a cycle that could have swallowed us whole. Standing on that shoreline with the wind in my hair, I made peace with the past, not by forgetting, but by learning. And I knew that no matter what the future held, whether Daniel truly changed or whether he remained lost in his own darkness, I had reclaimed my dignity, my freedom, and my legacy. Because this was the lesson I wanted Ethan and anyone who heard our story to remember. It is never too late to stand up, to fight back, to say no more. They may underestimate you, call you old, call you weak, but strength has nothing to do with age and everything to do with courage. And I had finally found mine.